Good evening, welcome. My name is Dan Koch. I'm the Artistic Director of Music at Lyall and also the founder and director of the Millbrook Community Festival Choir. Thank you so much for being here tonight as we celebrate the work of women composers. The theme of the concert is fairly straightforward. I came up with the idea just because it's the 200th anniversary of the birth of Clara Schumann, one of our most famous female composers, and we just kind of went from there. The piece that we just heard, Ave Regina Celorum, was by Isabella Leonardo, and she was an Italian composer of the Baroque era, so mid to late 1600s. It's the oldest piece on the program. She had local fame in her hometown, but was not widely known outside her home country. She joined the convent at age 16, and almost all of her compositions are dedicated to the Virgin Mary, as was the one we just heard, and you could read the translation in your program. This particular piece, it was written in 1684. We're going to move now to a modern piece that was composed in 2014 called Eternal Ruler of the Ceaseless Round. It was written for the American Guild of Organists Convention in that year. And Libby Larsen is one of America's most performed living composers with over 500 works spanning several genres. She was born December 24th, just like my son Donovan over here, but in 1950, not in 2000 and what year? Nine. And she actually founded the American Composers Forum back in the 70s, to which I am a member of. I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Joe Giacovino, who's making his way back down to the piano now. This is actually the first time we've used the organ along with the choir in 7 concerts, so we're really happy to have Joe here. Joe was actually my piano teacher when I was in high school, so we go way back, and we really appreciate him being here. Our next piece is probably a song that most of you are familiar with, the Scottish folk song Annie Laurie. You might not have known that it was written by a woman, Alicia Scott. She was later known as Lady John Scott, and like most folk songs, the authorship of the text is sketchy at best. It's most often associated with the Scottish poet William Douglas, but Alicia Scott herself claimed to have first encountered the words in a collection by a gentleman named Alan Cunningham. So who really knows? But whichever the case, she said that she altered much of the text significantly and wrote the 3rd verse herself. So no one really knows. If you're familiar with the song and you want to sing along, please join us. Thank you. Our next piece, A Better Resurrection, is by a woman named Georgia Stitt, who is best known as a musical theater composer and music director. She's written her own shows as well as song collections, and is also an in-demand vocal coach. She's vocal coach for a lot of hit TV shows like America's Got Talent, but she also did a stint as an artist in residence at a church in Manhattan and wrote a good amount of choral music that's quite beautiful. So we're going to hear that next. The text is also by a woman, Christina Rossetti, who lived in the 1800s in England. And you probably, if you're familiar with the Christmas songs, In the Bleak Midwinter and Love Came Down at Christmas, she penned both of those poems that were later set to music. So you may have heard of Christina Rossetti and not known it. But this is another one of her poems set to music by Georgia Stitt.
My heart within me, like a storm.
choir's going to take their union break. They've only been singing for 26 minutes, but that's how it goes. And in the meantime, we're going to hear a piano piece by Clara Schumann. And while we do that, some gentlemen are going to come around with some gold-colored plates. They're not actually solid gold. Don't think we have that much money here. And we keep our admission is free, so nobody feels like they can't come. But what we do ask is, if you are able to give us something, just helps sustain us, helps us keep doing what we do. All the money that we collect just goes right back into programming. So we would appreciate whatever you could give us. Before we hear the piece, I just want to talk a little bit about Clara Schumann, and we'll talk about her again in a little bit too. But it's nearly impossible to try and summarize Clara Schumann's career in just a little mid-concert blurb. What's interesting about many composers and historical figures in general is much of what we know about them is from journal entries that they kept. I'm afraid in 200 years, they're going to be reading our Twitter feeds to know what life was like in the 2019. But anyway, Clara Schumann had two very famous journals. And the first was from her childhood. Clara was her father's life project. He was a very demanding and esteemed music teacher in Leipzig and would give Clara daily lessons and demanded that she practice 2 hours every day. And if she would slack, he would write in her journal as her, so she would later read it and feel really good about herself. And one entry reads, translated from German, "My father," this is her father writing as her, "My father, who long had hoped for a change in disposition on my part, observed again today that I am just as lazy, careless, disorderly, disobedient, etc. as ever." But Clara was no slouch and was touring all over Europe before she entered her teens. When being a renowned concert pianist was no longer enough for her father, he decided that she needed to be a composer as well. She has 66 compositions to her credit, and this particular piano piece, the Romans, was written in 1853, which was towards the end of her creative output. And we'll learn a little bit more about Clara later on, but for now, let's enjoy Joe Giacovino playing some Clara Schumann as our gentlemen make their way with the plates. Thank you. Thank you. He learned that just for this concert today, so thank you, Joe. We are going to bring the choir back out, and when they get all set up, we're going to do a few hymns, actually. We're going to feature the work of the Flower Sisters, who we're probably not too familiar with. The hymn, Nearer My God to Thee, you probably will recognize if you don't know it by name. When you hear it, I'm sure you will. Sarah Flower Adams was an English hymn writer, and her most famous work is Nearer My God to Thee. We are most accustomed to hearing it set to the hymn tune called Bethany. If you're not aware, the way hymns are typically written, maybe 75 to 80% of the time, is there's all these hymn tunes, just melodies and harmonizations that exist, and the hymn writer who writes the words will sometimes be thinking of a particular tune as they write the words, so the syllable structure matches to an existing piece. Other times, however the syllable structure turns out in the text that they write, you can then adapt it to different hymn tunes. If you're ever looking through a hymnal in church, you might see down at the bottom a bunch of numbers, 8.8. Different numbers. And those are corresponding to how many syllables are in each line of the hymn. So you can technically apply different hymn texts to different hymn tunes. Anyway, the original tune that was written for Nearer My God to Thee has unfortunately been lost to history. It was written by Eliza Flower, Sarah's sister, and the only time it was ever published was in their lifetime, and the hymnal it was published in didn't write the music, only the words. So we'll unfortunately never know the way it was first heard, but this is certainly the most familiar way that we've heard the tune. And it was also as the Titanic was sinking, it's reported that this is the last thing that the band played. So, speaking of going down, the hymn that follows it, He Sendeth Sun, He Sendeth Shower, not to be too downer, was actually sung at Sarah's grave when she had passed away. I don't think it's depressing. I think it's beautiful. That's why I chose to include it as well. And then the piece to follow it, we're not going to break in between, called Hail to Thee, is one of 3 works that still exist today by Eliza Flower. So we wanted to not only honor the well-known female composers, but also the ones that are almost completely lost to history. So this is for those people. Thank you. As Joe's making his way back to the piano, we're getting back to Clara Schumann again. This time we'll talk about her second diary. It was a wedding gift from her husband, Robert Schumann, who is the arguably more famous Schumann by today's standards, though at the time he was not. But he's probably a composer that many of us are familiar with. This was to be a marriage journal where each one would write for a week, give it to the other one, they'd read it, and then write their own. It seems like she couldn't keep her own private journal. She always had to share it with somebody else. While they did share a deep love for each other, a love that they would have to take they had to take her father to court and sue him for the right to get married, which they were able to. But their marriage was plagued by Robert's mental health. Clara was the breadwinner of the family and by far the more famous of the two in their time. She could make more in a week of concerts than Robert could make in a month. But Robert became mentally unfit to run the household, and it was up to Clara to not only tend the children, they had 8, like me, manage the finances, and make a living. This came as a detriment to her creative output. One entry from the journal she read, "I once believed that I possessed creative talent, but I have given up this idea. A woman must not desire to compose. There has never yet been one to do it. Should I expect to be the one?" Robert also expressed concern, writing, "Clara has composed a series of small pieces which show a musical and tender ingenuity such as she has never attained before, but to have children and a husband who is always living in the realm of imagination does not go together with composing. She cannot work at it regularly, and I am often disturbed to think of how many profound ideas are lost because she cannot work them out." In 1854, Robert had a complete mental collapse and was committed at his own request to an insane asylum for the last 2 years of his life. Clara was refused visitation several times until finally being allowed to see him, and he died the next day. She would outlive him by 40 years. In those 40 years, she only composed one final piece, a set of variations on a theme by her husband. She instead dedicated her life as an interpreter of classical works, and namely her husband. And without this dedication in these 40 years, it is highly unlikely we would know of Robert Schumann as a composer at all. So our next piece, it's not really a famous piece of hers, but she's most of her more famous pieces are chamber music or piano work. So there's not much choral music by Clara Schumann, but this is a beautiful piece that she wrote.
Redeemer,
Thank you. We're drawing near to the end of our program tonight. We have two pieces left. And after we're done, we have a nice reception for everyone. If you'd like to stick around and have a snack, there's peanut butter cookies that are pretty good. I've already had some. So please plan on joining us for a few minutes and celebrating. Where There Is Light in the Soul is by Elizabeth Alexander, who is mainly known as a choral composer. She's written over 80 choral pieces. She began her composing career in 1980, and she's still quite active today. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to leave with a very popular hymn. You may have heard it. If you know it, please sing along. It's the Jesse Irvin setting of Psalm 23, The Lord Shepherd. If you're familiar, please join us.
He makes me down to
in the back for reception. Thank you.